Hey guys, welcome back to episode 17 of the Into the Deep podcast with Father Theodore and me, David Guirguis. Today's topic is going to be on spiritual exercises. So to kick us off, what is a spiritual exercise?
Well, a spiritual exercise would be things that you can do in order to sort of, like we talk a lot about, even like on this podcast, like we talk a lot about like how we should be and how to gain virtues and how to remove sin from our lives and things like that. And spiritual exercises are sort of like the practical application of how to do those things. You know, it's great to speak about wanting to change, and it's great to meditate on the importance of changing. But then I think people get stuck into okay, well, how do I do it? You know, I think a lot of people would love, I think you're one of them, would love a manual. It'd be like, this is a how-to guide to become a saint, for example.
Right.
And so I can't promise you that, because I think the spiritual life being a relationship is much more complex than that. Mm-hmm. But I do think spiritual exercises are a great way for us to sort of make some tangible changes in our lives that help us to become more Christ-like, which is, ultimately the goal.
So when you say spiritual exercises, we're talking about ways to strengthen my spiritual life through the same way that I would like exercise at the gym, or like actual real life things I can do to get closer to God.
Yeah. And hopefully when we talk, we're going to talk a little bit about, what does a spiritual exercise look like? What am I trying to do? How do I create those exercises? Consider me for the next hour or so to be your spiritual trainer, and then you can kind of get these ideas. Actually, most of these ideas are coming from a really nice book called Paradise of the Spirit by the late Bishop Yoannis. He was a bishop that died a decade or two ago, actually, by now. But yeah, these exercises are a great start. And as always, you should always check with your spiritual father about like implementing an exercise or what to do and things like that. But I hope this is just maybe an encouragement for people to say, hey, maybe this is something I need to implement in my spiritual life as part of my spiritual practice.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the times, I'm sure in the past I've thought that spiritual exercises were a thing, but if you would have asked me a year, 2, 3, or 10 ago, how would you, if you came to me and said, if you wanted to get closer to God, how would you do it? My only two answers would have been go to church or read the Bible. Like that's it. That's how you would do it. So knowing that there's more to it than that, and
it's not that those answers are wrong, by the way. Like, those are ways, but I think a lot of times we're not. It's like if I told you, well, how am I going to get more fit? And I told you, well, go to the gym.
It's very broad.
Sure, yeah, the gym is going to help me, but not if I just stand there, right? There's certain things I got to do if I'm gonna benefit.
Right. So it's not just about doing the right things, but it's also about, one way I'm thinking of it is like doing them in an optimal way.
I think that's part of it. And I think also is that maybe just even the variety of things, like you mentioned prayer, but there's like, we'll talk about like, there's aspects within prayer, how to do some exercises within prayer. We've talked about fasting before, but there are spiritual exercises that I can do, within fasting. And then even more than that, there are things that maybe we haven't considered that are wonderful spiritual practices for us to implement or think about implementing. But I want to say these are ideas and these are examples that maybe we're going to go over, but they're not everything. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really like about spiritual practice, spiritual exercises, and actually it's mentioned in Bishop Yoannis' book, one of the things that it forces you to do is to realize like the factors that influence me in my life. So if I want to do a spiritual practice, let's say, for example, I'm going to do a spiritual practice revolving around love, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about why actually saying, I want to be more loving isn't really that great of a spiritual practice. But if I say that I want to do that, why did you say it? Is because you had examined yourself and the Holy Spirit, sort of convicted you and told you, hey, you're lacking love in some situations. This and this happened, and you're reminded that, hey, this is maybe something that I'm falling short in. So it's a wonderful way for me to, even the concept of beginning a spiritual exercise forces me to sort of assess myself. And anytime I'm, that's really the goal of our life, to be constantly assessing ourselves, repenting, and becoming more and more Christ-like as we continue on our spiritual journey.
So I think this is I personally think I'm going to benefit a lot from this episode, because I feel like I am kind of falling off a little bit spiritually. And so having, this episode, or having tools at my disposal that can kind of reamp or like recharge that feeling, I think it'll be good to talk about.
The thing that I think sometimes we don't emphasize is, of course, our relationship with God is just that. It's a relationship. Again, this is not, this is not going to be a talk about a how-to guide to sainthood or anything like that, or even like an equation, right? Mm-hmm. Do this, plus this, then you're holy, or then you're good. Your spiritual life is much more complicated than that. And of course, first and foremost, my spiritual life begins and ends with the sacrifice that Christ, did for me on the cross, not just, my own efforts. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we are human, and we respond to sort of like having a goal and achieving things. And so why not sort of tap into that in order for me to sort of stay firm in my faith and to stay on the narrow path and be able to continue in my spiritual life.
So I think before we kind of dive into the specifics and everything, I'm sure there are some prerequisites that need to be met before, like, for example, you'd never just find yourself at the gym without first coming to the conclusion, like, I need to work out or I need to get fit. So what are kind of the prerequisites, would you say, for spiritual exercise?
Well, so I briefly touched on it, but I think there's a little bit more, is that I need to sort of recognize who I am, the things that are good, the things that are bad. And how can I do that? I think that the way that we do that is we look at, there are certain things that can sort of direct us, okay? There are things that direct us positively, and there are things that direct us negatively. Mm-hmm. When I think about, for example, the Bible, when I read the Bible regularly, what does it give me? It gives me, for example, lots of commands, right? It will say, forgive, love your enemies, be a peacemaker. These are commands. Mm-hmm. And so when I find myself maybe not doing those things, those can give me points. Like, those are positive things that I should be doing that maybe I am not. It also tells me negative things, right? It says, don't lie, don't steal, don't have filthy words in your mouth. These kind of things are sort of negative, what not to do. Mm-hmm. It also gives us positive and negative human examples, right? There are, quote unquote, good guys in the Bible and bad guys in the Bible, right? And so I learn from the good guys what to do and their reward and how God blesses their lives. And I learn from the bad guys, what not to do. Mm-hmm. And so I have to think about my sources. So the Bible is one of them. Another one of the sources that I would think about is the lives of the saints. Okay, so looking at the lives of the saints and trying to emulate certain things. You see certain saints like St. Moses or St. Mary of Egypt and St. Augustine, and you can't help but think of repentance and how they repented and how strong their repentance was. I will say a little caveat to that. Sometimes we read the lives of the saints. That does not mean I can emulate exactly what they did right away and in exactly the same way. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I read it and I'm like, wow, this is what they did. And they went and ran into the desert or did this and that and the other thing. And it's like, well, that's not me. Maybe God didn't give me that grace. Maybe I'm not there yet. So I'm not saying that I should copy it exactly, mm-hmm. but it's something to look forward, like to as a guide. Actually, it's really no different than, there are probably not just saints that we read about, but probably there are people in your life that you see and they're spiritually mature, or you see that they've reached some heights in their spiritual life, or you could tell by the way they carry themselves or whatever. You can tell that they have a close relationship with God, mm-hmm. and you sort of either explicitly ask them, or you just kind of paying attention to how they're behaving, mm-hmm. right? And you're like, well, you know what? I'm gonna try to do some of those similar things in order to hopefully achieve some similar results. Mm-hmm. Another source I mentioned right away when we talked is sitting with myself to know what I do, what I am, the good things, the bad things, which is, kind of a painful thing sometimes.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
But it's important.
Especially because there's a huge opportunity for you to have the wrong frame of reference too.
That's true. And that's why actually I do that. And then I go to my spiritual father with sort of like my findings. I tell him, like, hey, I think I'm judgmental because X, Y, Z, or I think I'm loving because X, Y, Z. My spiritual father helps to temper me from not going one way or another. One thing that they mention, like Sayyidina mentions in the book, that I really like is the exercise of sort of contemplating about my strengths and my weaknesses, especially my weaknesses, helps me to empathize with others. When I'm like highly aware of my deficiencies, I can see those deficiencies in other people. And instead of judgment, which is often the first feeling that comes around when we see somebody doing something they ought not to, actually what I feel is empathy. I think like, I know what he's talking about, or I've been there, or I struggle with that same sin, or I struggle with sin just like he does or she does. And so it helps me. People who are prideful very often are not assessing themselves on a regular basis, because if they were, they would see that like, hey, I'm falling short. And so if I'm falling short, when I see someone else falling short, we're not really much different.
Isn't pride one of the tougher ones, because the problem is also the thing preventing you from seeing the problem? So
absolutely.
It's like this feedback loop.
Absolutely. Actually, it's hard. Pride is a very difficult one. And some people call pride like the root of all sins or the mother of all sins because of that, that fact.
Okay. So when I was going through and I saw the difference between not just doing the things you're supposed to, but also staying away from the things you're not supposed to do.
Yes.
It, transferring that thought to the gym, it's like you can work out as much as you want, but if your diet isn't in check, you're really not going to make any progress.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Okay, so what are some of these spiritual exercises that we can kind of dive into and talk about, and how are they going to benefit me?
Well, we can talk about this the exercises that I wanted to mention so that we can get just an idea. But again, I want to say like this isn't everything. These are just some of the thoughts that Attentiveness had and wrote in Paradise of the Spirit. But before we get to those, like I want to talk about like what makes for a good spiritual exercise. Okay, there are sort of certain qualities that would make for a good spiritual exercise. For example, and actually this is good, I think, advice even outside of the spiritual realm. Like when I'm making a spiritual exercise, I should be specific. Okay, what I mean by that is I shouldn't say my spiritual exercise this month is I'm going to be more loving. Okay, this is incredibly vague. like what does it mean to be more loving? Or say I'm going to be more humble. Okay, I mean it's a so admirable goal, but how? People who are familiar with goal setting and things, they'll say that the best way to make goals are SMART goals. It's an acronym, and the first
specific
is exactly
the
first thing of a SMART goal is that it's specific, and so it should be more specific than being more loving. And so you'll see the difference when you talk about some of the examples. Like it's not maybe being more loving. It's sort of I would say. How do I I'll be a little bit more specific than that. I'll be like, I'm going to do, 2 acts of kindness every day that I get nothing in return. Right. It's like something a little bit more specific. That way I'm I'm trying to be more loving, but I'm doing it in a way that is a little bit more easy to sort of quantify and a little bit better that I can assess myself. Did I do well? Did I not do well? And while I'm doing that, of course, I will become more loving.
Right.
Because I'm acting in loving ways.
So when I read this part of the chapter, it reminded me of I listen to a lot of podcasts in my free time. And there was a podcast I listened to not too long ago that said, it was like a guy that's talking about business. He's like, instead of focusing or optimizing on the outputs, focus on the inputs, because it's really easy to, in the same like measurable way, if saying like be more loving, it's like, okay, well, there's a million ways to do that. And really there's, but I'm going to do this thing as a result of being like, I'm going to do this many
this
things
thing and
at
this
this
will
time.
make me more loving.
Yeah. So like dissecting it down into, okay, instead of just having a goal is like, okay, well, what am I going to do to get me to the goal? And that's what you kind of focus on.
And when you think about it, it's like, if I were to go to anybody and I would say, do you think you should be more loving? Everyone's going to be like, yeah, for sure. Should I be more humble? Definitely. Should I be more generous? Yes. But how? And in what way? And how am I specifically deficient in those things? I think doing that sort of makes it much, much more successful.
And obviously talking to your spiritual father would be a good way to make sure you have the right subcategories that are going to get you to this.
I agree, and also keeps me away from some extremes. Like we'll talk about that especially when we talk about fasting. Some people, they're very excited about fasting and they want to fast in a way that is sometimes actually physically extreme, you know, and that's not good. You know, the point of fasting is not to harm my health, right? That's not a goal. So that's one thing, being specific. The other thing that I would say is I don't want to maybe take on 15 goals at once.
Oh,
you know,
that's my problem.
Yeah, I mean, I like I've known you long enough that I know you're the type of person who's like, okay, I get amped about something, get excited about something, and I just want to go 150%.
Yeah,
and that's wonderful. But you know, the spiritual life is more like a marathon than it is a sprint. And I need to be and actually think about what we're doing. Right, I'm really trying to modify how I normally behave. That's an incredible feat. Like that's not something that like really comes regularly or naturally. I might run into the problem where I can't even remember all my goals if I don't have them. And I'm not accounting for, you know, just how difficult it is to even do one. You know, let's say my spiritual exercise is I'm going to pray from the Igbeya, you know, 2 times a day, right? And maybe I'm not used to doing that. Even this one act that maybe it's taking 10 or 15 minutes of my time. It's not in my normal schedule, you know, not in my normal thing. You know, I was a dentist and trying to get people to floss, for example, get that to be their normal part of their routine. If they were already flossers, it was fine. It was easy.
right.
To get someone who never did and is like, now I need you to, even if they know it's right, even though they know it's only gonna take 5 minutes, it wasn't the easiest thing in the world to convince them. And we're talking about something that I think, you know, being more loving is a lot harder to do than, you know, like floss once a day. So I should make sure not to try to do more than like maybe 1 or 2 at a time. The other thing that I would think of is like I need to do it for a long time. Like if I have a goal, let's say like we said, I'm going to do, you know, 2 acts of kindness every day. I think I should stay in that goal for a pretty good amount of time, you know, 6 months, a year. Like I should stay in that goal for at least a few months, you know, maybe 3 months would be the lowest, like the smallest I would go. Because when I do it regularly, it becomes ingrained in me and a part of who I am. Rather than I'm going to just do this really good, really well for a week. You know, easy come, easy go, right? Like I do it and then I forget about it and it's over. And it's not a race, right? I'm trying to sort of gain virtues and that will take my entire life. And then I'm not really accounting for also like God's grace, you know, how he strengthens me towards those goals, how he provides for me like the means and the capability that is beyond my own strength and understanding in order for me to achieve those goals.
Yeah, I think that speaks a lot to kind of who we are as humans. Just like we're very much creatures of habit, and like trying to change literally anything is
Yes.
like pulling teeth from.
We're underestimating how really difficult that is. You know, think about for people who are listening. I'm sure you have some spiritual practices that you do regularly. The ones that you do regularly are very easy. You know, the people who come to church, they've come to church their entire lives every week. It's assumed. It's a non-negotiable for them. It's not even, they don't even think twice about it. People maybe who grew up in a situation where maybe I don't go to church every week, right? Maybe I go to church once a month, or maybe I'm just like a Christmas, Easter only kind of person, you know? To change that, to become a person, a churchgoer every week, that's incredibly difficult. And I think if I try to have a million exercises at once, or I try to do it very quickly and very like not like in a gradual way, I'm setting myself up for failure.
And so not to kind of backtrack, but what's the first step in this? Like, how do you come to the realization that like maybe I should start a spiritual practice, or what kind of triggers the need for one in you internally? Like,
it's motivated by my self-examination. So I'm sitting with myself and I recognize, for example, sometimes I say things and I regret the things that came out of my mouth. Or, for example, I've run into problems with my friends because I joke with them in a way that offends them or hurts their feelings, right? And so I begin with my self-examination that reveals to me, by the grace of God, a deficiency. Mm-hmm. And then I think to myself, what is a way in which I can work on this deficiency? For example, like I could say to myself, I'm going to compliment my immediate family at least once a day. If I like I said, remember I said it shouldn't be so general. So being more loving is not really great. But if I wanted to say, I'm going to compliment my immediate family at least once a day, this is a loving thing. Or even it could be directed in many ways, right? Maybe I want to be more grateful. So gratitude, right? So I'm going to thank my friends at least once a week for the things that they do for me. Things like that I hold myself accountable to, so that I slowly improve in those areas. But again, going back to your question, it starts with my self-examination and a recognition of some, deficiency within my spiritual life. And we all have them. And we have many, actually, if we are taking the time to look.
Yeah, so thinking on the extremes of that, it's like, I feel like there's really not a real healthy medium way. It's like either the person who's thinking about it is, oh, I have nothing wrong with me, I'm doing great. Or it's like I have every single problem that there is in the book and I need to fix them all at the same time.
Well, yeah. No, I think both of those are both not great, right? I could recognize that by God's grace, I am not, the devoid of anything good. God does a lot of good works within me. But at the same time, I can recognize, I fall into sin. I don't think this is anything strange or surprising to say I fall into sin. And we've talked about before, is it's like when I ask, do you think you're a sinner? Everybody always answers yes. But then when you start to talk to them about specific things they've done wrong, then they begin a little bit be more uncomfortable and deny, right? And so we all recognize that we're falling short. I don't think it's strange to say I'm not perfect. But then to do the little bit more difficult work of pointing out the specific things in which I am imperfect, it is a little painful and it does cause a little bit of hurt. But ultimately for my benefit. Again, if I'm going to go back to your workout analogy, working out is kind of painful sometimes. And I feel sore the next day and I'm sweating and I'm panting and all this kind of stuff. But I'm doing that ostensibly for a good reason.
And when you were talking about, if you already we're doing the things, it's very easy. I think of like doing the same way each week.
Sure.
You're not going to really gain anything from it. You have to push yourself and
it's got to be uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I always tell you, like the last set has to you have to go to failure, for example, if you want to gain muscle.
Yeah, that's like where the real growth happens.
Exactly. So I kind of touched on a little bit, so I said to be specific, and I said I should take my time in my spiritual exercise. I touched a little bit about how I need to be gradual in my spiritual exercises. So I should be careful not to, let's say, for example, say, okay, my prayer life, deficient. And then you decide my spiritual exercise, I'm going to pray all 7 hours of the Ekbeya from beginning to end every day. This is sort of a huge leap from where I am to where I'm going. And that's unsafe because it leads to, first of all, one of two things. Either maybe I'm able to do it, right? If I'm able to do it, it will give me tons of pride. And also the likelihood that I'm able to maintain that as something that is sustainable is probably not that likely. And the second thing is, if I'm unable to do it, then I'm a failure. A spiritual life is not for me, and I quit. Actually, keeping in the same theme, when you think about like dieting, people who yo-yo diet, they will come and say, okay, I'm gonna eat 1,100 calories a day. No carbs, all this stuff. And actually, maybe in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they actually lose tons of weight. And actually, they start to get compliments, right? Oh, you're losing tons of weight. You look so good, whatever, And then they're starving, like they're starving. And so you find them like binging at night or doing all sorts of extreme behaviors because the initial behavior was extreme. Any dietitian would tell you, what kind of healthy diet you need is something sustainable. Something that doesn't feel like I'm constantly depriving myself. Right. It feels like I'm eating foods I enjoy within limits, and there's some moderation, and there are treats every once in a while. You know what I mean? Like it has to have a sustainability to it. And so when I do these spiritual exercises gradually, I can have some sustainability. If I'm thinking about, for example, a spiritual exercises regarding speech, and I say, okay, I'm going to practice silence. And I say I'm going to practice silence as if like I'm practicing silence. Like I'm not going to speak to anybody. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I'm a little bit of a talker. Like for me to do that from 0, like from 100 to 0, it's going to be extreme. It's going to be painful, and I will fail. And then when I fail, I will find myself, questioning. Are spiritual exercises for me? Is the spiritual life in general for me? Like maybe this isn't right. Just like the dieting thing is like, oh, I'm just destined to be overweight, or I'm destined to whatever. It's just not in me. It's not in my genetics. It's not in my capability, whatever the case may be.
I think there are definitely some certain personality types that are kind of understanding this a little bit more than others. I definitely...
This is ringing true to you.
Yeah, I actually, funny enough, when I was reading through it today, when we came up on the section of be, I don't know the word. Let me see if I find it. Like be gradual. Don't
Sure.
be all in. I screenshotted that part and I sent it to Josh, and I was like, I think we should probably read on this a little bit more. It's I feel like it's directed right at us.
I think it's very easy. I mean, I don't think you're alone. I think a lot of people they get excited about something and they want to go 100%. They really feel motivated to do the thing, and that's wonderful. But I want us to be able to be doing it 10 years from now, and I want it to be part of your life. That's not that I want you to do it, for a day. Going back even to like analogies about health or anything like that, it's like I need it to be a lifestyle change so that I can be healthy forever, right? Until I die, rather than a fad. Most people actually, they lose weight, they gain it back. They lose weight, they gain it back, because they're not actually changing who they are or what they're doing on a regular basis. They're more like falling into they're getting very excited, very hyped. I want to look good. I want to fit into this dress. I want to whatever. And then it's not sustainable. So being gradual is so important.
Actually, that one vibed pretty well with Bune AP's talk, where like the way he started out was basically like, this is not supposed to make you feel good. This is like, everyone is so focused on like, I want to feel happy or good or whatever. And he's like, actually, we don't care about any of that. And like dove straight into like, you have to be convinced first that what you're doing, it first of all is going to benefit you,
yes.
but also like, because if you don't think it's going to benefit you, you're failing before you even start. Or you have no reason to start.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be convinced, because you're about to do something that you won't really like for the first, especially right away. Again, going back to like a diet, like no one prefers celery over cake, right? But why do people do it? It's because they don't want to have diabetes. They don't want to be overweight. They want to look good in a bathing suit, whatever it is. So that's why that's their why, right? When you understand your why, you're willing to put up with a little bit of discomfort. You know what I mean? Why do you, for example, go to bed at 9:00 when, my friends are hanging out or things are going on or I want to have fun? It's like, well, I know how I'm going to feel at 6 a.m. in the morning when I got to get up. So I'm going to go to bed. Right. So I need to actually be certain of my why. And the reason I need to be certain is there will be times while I'm doing the thing, this is tough, or am I sure I wanted to do this, or this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. And the why will motivate me. But if I don't have the why and I'm just kind of like going, just doing it to do it, I'm not going to be able to continue.
And so I kind of have an answer in my head but I don't think it's the full answer of what I'm about to ask is, where do you get your why from? Who provides that kind of information to you?
Well, maybe I'll start with what you think the answer to that is.
Well, I think a much less likely answer is when you mentioned earlier about like God's grace, and like when you feel that connection or for whatever reason, that
the joy of having a walk with God, like knowing that I'm walking close, alongside God.
Yeah, it's like such a great feeling that you're like, I want to do whatever I can to continue feeling this.
You see these holy people and they're living holy lives and they look like they're so full of, God's peace and God's joy, and you're like, I want the same thing. I think that's a wonderful why. There are, I think, lots of really valid whys. When I think about these deficiencies, I think I kind of touched on it before. It's like, sometimes my why can be, this is affecting my life. This is affecting my social life. This is affecting my relationships. This is affecting my spiritual life in a negative way. And so I no longer want that to be the case. People who are, for example, I know this is an extreme example, but people who are addicts, people who are alcoholics or people who are addicted to drugs or whatever, when they do eventually, by God's grace, when they do eventually snap out of those things and seek treatment and get rid of those addictions in their lives, what is it that pushed them to do that? Many, many times, they've fallen all the way back to rock bottom. They're like, wow, this thing that I thought was great and fun and I loved it and the high was great or the whatever was awesome is not worth this pain that's happening, right? So their why of why do I need to quit? Why do I need to stop? Is this is essentially sucking my entire life dry. It's taking away everything that is beneficial to me. I've lost everything because of this addiction. And so that's their why. And so sometimes my why can be, this is negatively impacting me. I'm not loving and that's negatively impacting me. I'm prideful and that's negatively impacting me. And that even is not even to touch on, it's definitely negatively impacting, like what you mentioned, my walk with God, my standing with Him, how he, how I'm not living maybe a close relationship with Him, how I'm not following His commandments. Those kind of things are obviously of even more importance than the temporal consequences.
So I'm going to keep going back to the exercise, the gym thing.
I mean, we are talking about exercise, so it makes sense.
So in almost any kind of exercise or routine or anything like that, you incorporate rest days.
Sure.
Days where you don't, not necessarily revert back, but you just don't go over. Does the same apply to spiritual?
It most definitely can. It most definitely can for the positive things. Okay. So for example, but not for the negative things. What do I mean by that? Let's say part of my spiritual exercises is going to be about like not lying. Okay. Mm-hmm. This is actually, I always ought not to lie. I can't be like, well, Sunday's a cheat day and I'll just lie. You understand what I mean? But when I'm talking about like positive things, let's say, for example, I'm practicing some level of the virtue of silence. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to speak unless I'm spoken to. Okay. That's my rule that I've made for myself or that I've made that I'm not going to speak unless I'm spoken to. And then all of a sudden I see two people speaking and one person is dealing with the other person very unjustly. And you feel in your heart, God is convicting you. I need to speak. I need to defend this person. I can, of course, make an exception, right? I'm not a slave to these exercises. These exercises are tools in my hand, And so I make an exception and I speak. Or even I can have it built into my exercise that like, hey, I'm going to do this, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, and that's okay too, because I'm trying to build up a virtue. The only thing that I'm saying is like, I cannot speak this way when I'm speaking about sin, right? You can say like, well, I'm going to not steal, but on Tuesdays, stealing is okay.
You're like, oh, I haven't stolen in a whole week. I deserve a little stealing. Okay.
Exactly.
That makes
resisting sin doesn't have exceptions. I should be always striving. Not to say that I'm always successful. Sometimes I fail, but I shouldn't give myself the leeway to be like, okay, and now today is okay to do something bad.
I guess how do you kind of connect it when it's when the spiritual exercise that you're doing is what is preventing you from sinning? Like for the example of silence, right? Like let's say you have a problem with gossiping. So you're trying to practice silence, but now you're on a rest day and you're like, oh, I can talk. I'm not, really exercising, but then how do you stop yourself from like, well, doesn't mean I can go gossip as much as I want now on this day, or you know what I mean?
That's something I mentioned a bunch of keys to success. And one of the ones I didn't mention yet is to, exactly like I do when I'm working out, to track my progress. Okay. So like even nightly, I could go into like have a notebook or have a like somewhere where I take some notes, and I'll say like, here's what happened in my spiritual exercise and it went well, thank God. Or here's what happened in my spiritual exercise and I fell short. Or today was my rest day, and because it was my rest day, XYZ happened. So therefore maybe I ought not to have a rest day. So like I ought to be like assessing myself continually, even within the exercise. and keeping track. What's working, and thank God for it. What's not working, figure out why is it not working so that I can improve it.
And
we do this in every aspect of our lives. What important thing do I undertake that I don't have some sort of tracking mechanism for? Right? Grades at school, I track. Like there's like whatever sort of employee, like what do they call it? Like a yearly, like a
review.
Like a review or whatever. If I'm lifting, I might be like writing down how much I'm lifting and how many sets I do. If I'm trying to count calories, I mean, I'm counting calories. I'm writing down everything that I'm eating. In every aspect of our lives, if it's important to us, we take it down and we write it down, and we're sort of like not just counting on, oh yeah, I think I got it, or I think I remember. I'm a little bit more exacting than that. And I should do the same thing with my spiritual life.
And is that just as simple as actually just having like a notebook and writing
absolutely.
down a couple?
I mean, it's even easier now. You have your phone and whatever, but like a notebook is really nice because you could sit. I do my prayers, I read my Bible, I have my notebook, and I just kind of write in it. It's really just more time with God. Sometimes people ask me, it's like, how do you spend, a lot of time with God? What do you do? It's like, well, I pray, and then I'm like, what do I do after that? It's like, okay, I'm praying, and I read his word, and then I sit with him and review my day, and I thank him for the things that have gone really well, and I ask his forgiveness for the things that I've fallen short. And in that way, I'm able to spend longer and longer time with God. It doesn't feel like a burden. It just feels like I'm catching up with my Father at the end of my day.
Okay. So I know I'm sure people are really, like I am, waiting to get into the specific examples, just so I can see kind of what maybe would pertain to me, or what something I hear that it's like, oh, I've never thought about trying to work on this. So what are some examples of different spiritual exercises?
So there are a lot of examples and we can go over a couple of them. Before I do, I want to just share this prayer that he mentions in the book. And I really loved it. Because again, we always have to have our perspective about what we're doing. I'll just read it verbatim, what he wrote, because it was beautiful. He says, Lord, without you, I can do nothing. I cannot control myself. These exercises are only a kind of prayer to express my desire to live with you and not to show that I am depending on my own strength. Please, Lord, help me with your grace. It's a wonderful prayer because we're talking about exercise and we're talking about the effort that we're exerting. But I have to always keep in mind, like St. James mentions, all good things come down from the Father of lights. So everything that I'm able to do that is good, I'm able to do them by God's grace and with his strength. And again, these are tools in my hands in order, like I love the phrase where he says, these exercises are kind of a prayer that I'm offering that to show you my desire to live with you or to be with you. So I want to just keep that in mind as we go through some of these.
I actually have a kind of a bone to pick with the
a bone to pick with the prayer that I said I love.
No, I mean just I guess the concept of it.
No, it's okay.
And I've always kind of thought about it, so I'm curious what is this not like a way to, or could this not be seen as like detrimental to someone's like self-esteem, let's say? Because you're saying basically, if you're successful in whatever you're aiming for, you're like, it's thank God.
To God,
like God is the one that allowed me to be successful.
And if I fail, it's my fault.
If I fail, it's all my fault. Like, I mean, is that not, when do I ever get to win a little bit?
Sure. But we are conquerors with Christ. Like we are conquerors with Christ. His successes within us are our successes. But I'm saying is like I need to attribute it to its right source. It's not just me on my own doing these things. It's me that's working, answering God's call to holiness and successfully doing that. Can I rejoice in those things? Absolutely. Can I be, quote unquote, proud of myself? Sure. As long as I'm remembering that it is God who is ultimately the driver of those things. But actually, I know you're saying like, this is sort of unfair. Why are all the good things attributed to God and all the bad things attributed to me? But actually, God is all good, right? If I believe in the God that we as Christians believe in, everything that is good comes from God, and everything that is not good cannot be from God, right? So if it's anything that's not good, it has to have a attribution somewhere else besides God.
I want to argue, but it's not about this. I want to argue that topic, but not in this episode. So I guess I'll it for some reason it just clicked for me when you answered. When you're thanking God, it's not that you did nothing,
No.
and God did everything. It's kind of like
it's more like I responded to God's God's call or God's help, or like God wants me to do good and is encouraging me to do good at all times. But he also is giving me free will, so I choose to do those good things, and I thank God for the capability to do it, the idea to do those good things, the perseverance to do it, the strength to overcome temptation, all of the things that gets me to those good things.
Okay, so I sounds so selfish the way that I'm thinking of it, but like, so there is some attribute to you being successful that like you were given the opportunity to be successful, and you also did the work.
Yeah, I just mean like, of course I can be proud of like my achievements, recognizing that God is really the driver behind anything good that I do.
Okay.
If I truly am living for him, everything I do is for him and due to him. Actually it says in scripture, without me, you can do nothing. And this is what our Lord Jesus Christ says.
But yeah, okay. I'm like trying to connect the spiritual exercise to like, doing the spiritual exercises will get you to a place where that's how you're thinking, which will then result in you like you have to start it somewhere, I guess.
Yes, I mean, like if going along those lines, maybe a spiritual exercise that you're thinking of or would be helpful for someone who's struggling in this point that you're talking about is some sort of exercise regarding thankfulness. Okay, so trying to think of, let's say an exercise could be like, I'm going to give thanks to God for 5 things, every day, and I'm going to mention them in my my silent prayers as I'm going about my day. Mm-hmm. And when I do that, I will find that I'm like, wow, like I'm thanking God, for example, that I got to work on time. There wasn't traffic, or I didn't get into any accidents. I'm thanking God for the food that He has given me, and that I have a lunch. Not everybody has food on the table. I'm thanking God for the ability and the health to be able to go to work, or even thanking God for the fact that I have a job, right? And so I cultivate within myself the remembrance that God provides me. Our Lord Jesus Christ, He says that God loves us very much, that He gives us the things that we need even without us asking. And so when we don't ask and we get them, sometimes we can feel, even without noticing it, we feel entitled, right? This just happens. Mm-hmm. Think about anybody who is like perfectly healthy. They never think to themselves, oh, it's so convenient that I can breathe, right? But someone who has a lung problem, they look at you and they say, wow, I would kill for 10 minutes of being able to breathe deeply the way that you do. And so a lot of times we forget. And so I think an exercise surrounding gratefulness or thankfulness would be super nice in someone who's struggling with what you're talking about.
Okay.
So should we get into some of the exercises?
Yeah, I'm ready.
So there's a whole category of exercises that have to do with like humility or meekness. One exercise that he mentions in the book is to avoid bothering or hurting anybody's feelings. And you can maybe, it doesn't necessarily have to be just about humility. That could go into other categories. It could be about love and things like that. When you think about, okay, I'm going to resolve for the next, for the next 6 months, every day, my goal is I'm not going to bother anybody. I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings. And I'm always thinking about this during my day. And then I'm about to speak, I'm about to say things, or someone says something to me. I think to myself, well, wait a minute. This goal right now is not to hurt anybody's feelings. So is what I'm about to say going to hurt somebody's feelings? And it's a wonderful exercise because it makes us sort of start to think before we speak. It sounds so trivial, but like most of the time we're not thinking before we speak.
Okay. Can I?
You have to
combat this one a little bit.
You have to.
I know in the chapter in this book, it talks a lot about like you really can't go to the extremes on certain things because you also have like social obligations or like
sure.
For example, if I wanted to practice silence, like I can't go to my job and just not talk.
Sure.
Like, it's not how it works. Sure. And so it almost seemed like there's a level to like, obviously God is first, but then like you also can't neglect the world and the people in the world. I guess there was like an emphasis on this, like you still have to be a productive member of society,
Sure.
So what happens when they conflict with each other? What happens when, in order to not hurt somebody's feelings, I almost can't, talk about God, for example, or accept things that I know to maybe be not what I believe.
So remember what I said, maybe closer to the beginning. These exercises are tools in our hands in order to become closer to God. And it is okay to have exceptions when they're needed. I say that carefully because if everything's an exception, then I'm actually not doing the exercise. But yes, let's say, for example, my exercise is I'm going to avoid hurting anybody's feelings. But maybe someone who is in my care or is in my responsibility needs to be gently rebuked. Because if they don't, something very bad is going to happen to them, right? And in my gentle rebuke, their feelings are hurt. Not because I was harsh, but because their feelings were hurt. That's really up to them, not up to me. Did I not follow my rule? Did I break my exercise? I would say no in that sense, or at least I would say that was a needed exception to my rule. Because again, I'm not a slave. I'm not worshiping these spiritual exercises, right? What is the goal of the spiritual exercise? All of us, I think, could stand to work on not hurting people's feelings more. That doesn't mean that there are some times in which it was necessary for somebody's feelings to be hurt, or it was completely out of my control that somebody's feelings would be hurt.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm saying, and actually I know you very well, and I think that so I'll cut this off at the head before we get sort of too stuck in the weeds. If we focus on the extremes of any of these, that's really not the point, right? Could you find me an exception to every one of these exercises? You absolutely can, and I'm not denying that, right? I'm not saying to you this is a hard and fast rule that you must always do. Actually, there's no such thing. Except, like I said, there's no excuse for sin, right? I should always not sin. But when I'm looking at these, for example, there's one that says not losing one's temper. Okay, I have to, the exercise would be, I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm never going to lose my temper. Okay, and that's going to be a spiritual exercise. Maybe I have anger problems, maybe whatever. And then I get put into a situation in which actually I need to be animated in order to get across a very important point. I think that's pretty rare, to be honest with you, but I can envision that would be a plausible scenario. Okay. Maybe I'm being robbed, or, there are probably some plausible scenarios why losing my temper might be appropriate. Okay. So it's not as if it's not as if it's not a contest to see, can I poke holes of where can we break this rule? You can. Absolutely, you can. That's actually not the point. The point is actually, if you're doing this most of the time, in most situations, you're going to get what your goal is, which is I'm going to become more humble, more meek. Okay? For example, another one that's maybe more to deal with sins of talking or speech. I'm not going to interfere in anybody's business. So I'm not going to offer, as a rule for myself, I'm not going to offer an opinion unless it is asked of me. Okay? And for those of us who, like to talk, and for those of us who have lots of opinions, that's a difficult spiritual exercise, But I think you learn a lot when you do those things. I think one of the things, me personally, when I've tried to do this particular exercise, what I've learned is I'm not always the smartest person in the room. People come to the conclusion that I would have come to, or even a better conclusion that I would have come to by themselves. They didn't need me to interject my opinion to get there. Sometimes well, if I don't say this, they'll never figure it out. And I was well, actually, a lot of times they will. I'm not as important as I think I am.
Okay, so I think my mindset has shifted now to a little bit more appropriately. But also,
I knew I had to warn you. I know you.
I was so I guess the only reason that the not making anyone angry, I think the problem I would have with that one specifically, and again, I know we're not talking specifics, but is it would be much easier to focus on ones that are like not losing my temper, because that's something that I control within myself.
Sure.
That I'm my own judge.
Oh, you're
for.
saying like not making anybody angry. Well, that's on them sometimes. They decide to get angry.
I could look at somebody the wrong way and they'll be angry. So
Sure.
it's like, I understand that the main idea of these is to maybe in a scenario where you would have hurt somebody's feelings previously, now you don't.
There are things that objectively would make the average person angry. Okay. And then there are innocuous things that make an incredibly sensitive or hurt person angry. I think it would be impossible to hold yourself accountable to that extent. Okay. And actually there's another way you can look at it, right? If someone, for example, is attacking Christianity and you're defending Christianity, and that angers them. Maybe they've been hurt by religion. Maybe they've been hurt by Christianity specifically. You defending Christianity hurts them. Okay. Yes, it hurts them, but did you do anything wrong? No. And actually, even if like these spiritual exercises are not sin, you know what I'm saying? So like if I didn't do it, it's not like it was wrong.
Right.
You understand what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I made this person angry. Did I sin in making them angry? Not necessarily.
You don't have to, but
Yeah, not necessarily.
I see. Okay. So then also a question before we continue, because I'm sure, well, at least this is what I'm thinking. So I'm sure a couple other people are. When I hear all these spiritual exercises, and obviously you said not to go crazy on them.
I know you're always you're over here being like, what are the next 10 that I'm going to do right away?
So a lot, kind of along those lines. But when I am picking my deficiency or my spiritual exercise, and I'm sure the answer is going to be talk with your spiritual father, but just kind of in general, should I pick
prioritize certain ones over the others, or is that what you're going to ask?
It's, I guess, should I focus on one that I know I have the worst issue with, or one that I am like 50-50 and like kind of work? Because I imagine, like, let's say I have a really, really bad temper. Every single thing sets me off. But sometimes I raise my voice, but most of the time I'm pretty quiet.
Yeah.
It'd be more beneficial for me to conquer my temper, but it's a little bit harder to do.
You know what this kind of reminds me of? Like, if you ever watch any like podcasts or listen to any podcasts about like finance, right? And then there are different schools of thought about how to attack debt. Right? Like some people will be like, oh, you should do snowball, right? You should do like take the smallest thing and then you add it, people can look it up if they're interested. And then there's other people who are like, no, like the mathematical thing to do is to attack the debt with the highest interest. Right. And both schools of thought from a psychological perspective have some merit, right? Well, the first one has a psychological merit and the second one has a analytical mathematical merit, And I would say that, along those same lines, I think the answer might be different for everybody. Like what I think maybe your why really matters. Like, so like if I'm convinced that this thing is ruining my every, interaction, then actually that would be maybe a good motivator for me to do it, because that's not something I would give up on pretty easily, because I can easily see how much it's hurting me. But at the same time, some other people might like, well, give me a small victory. That'll feel really good. And then it'll make me sort of encouraged to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So, I can see both. I don't think anything, one of the wonderful things about this particular topic is like, it's not as if there's like a wrong way to do this, right? As long as I'm doing it sort of within the guidelines of my spiritual father, it's like, there's going to be some variation of how to go about this. And everybody's going to sort of attack it differently. And if they're doing it sincerely, it's going to be beneficial to anybody who does it. Okay.
I can get on board with that, I think. What are some other ones that
Another one that I really like, actually, along the lines of like my speech, to have a spiritual exercise is not to complain. So I am like a word or a sentence of complaint is not going to pass my lips. Imagine, actually, I would love, like people who are listening to the podcast, I would love for them to say to themselves, okay, for a week, I'm just going to try that, to not complain. And you'll be so surprised how often you are finding yourself stopping yourself. Because we complain a lot. I mean, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm a complainer, but like, I think that all of us can stand to maybe do something like that. So I love that one, not to complain. Very simple, very easy one to understand, a very difficult one to do, because I think, actually, I didn't live in the the working world for an incredibly amount of time, a long time. But I know that like the work environment sort of lends itself to griping about work. You know, we like to, oh, the boss did this, or can you believe this new policy or this new thing, or oh, can you believe we have to whatever, or we have to travel to this, or do, you know what I mean? Or like the raise was this much instead of that. Like I think we sort of enjoy that. Maybe it's a misery loves company sort of thing.
Probably.
but you know, not being like taking a step back, you think about it, it's like, wow, this is incredibly negative, you know? And it's like, for most of us, you know, maybe we don't absolutely adore work and wish we didn't have to, but at the same time, for most of us, it's not a miserable thing. Like we're doing our career that we worked hard to achieve in, and we thank God that we're able to, you know, to have a job and be able to bring home resources for my family. I mean, there's a lot of positive things that I'm completely overlooking to sort of gripe with everybody at the water cooler about, you know, the new policy that got implemented or whatever. So not to complain.
Okay.
Another one that I thought was really cool, that was also interesting, is having a pleasant face in front of everybody, or like smiling, being sort of, I guess, cheerful. You know, being cheerful, which is difficult to do, I think, at times, depending on sort of what's going on in my life. So those are some of the exercises that have to do with either humility, and some of them have to do with exercises of the tongue. There's a whole group of exercises that he mentions in the book. Exercises of against condemning others. And he says, okay, make a rule for yourself. I'm not going to talk about anybody behind their back. Okay? And actually, whether good or bad, I'm just people that are not here, I'm not going to talk about them. And so for someone who's like, you know what, gossip is a problem for me. When I create this rule for myself, I'm not going to speak about anybody that is not present, right? I'm going to be silent unless, you know, it's about people who are present. Try it, you know, try it for a day just to see, you know, and maybe that's some advice that I could give is like, you know, you're thinking, well, what should I do or whatever. And it's like, okay, try one for a day and see what it's like. And that will give you a little bit of insight into, is this a deficiency in my life? Is this difficult? Is this something that changes my behaviors or helps me to increase in virtue or keeps me away from sin? You'll find out in an instant. Like I think it'll be really easy. So not to talk about people behind their backs. Another one, a good one, not insulting anybody, whether to their face or behind their back. I think to their face, most likely when I'm talking about insults to people's faces, I'm talking probably about the jokes we say or the things we say to our friends that we think are funny, but might be, you know, hurt each other's feelings. And I'm guilty of that from time to time as well. I think all of us do that. You know, we think in good nature we're trying to be funny, when in fact, you know, it's kind of hurtful. And then there's, of course, the more overt, like directly insulting you, right? If I'm mad at you, I don't like you or whatever. Like to not insult anybody. That's a nice exercise of not condemning others. I talked about like not complaining. I can bring it if I'm talking about sort of condemnation of others. I think about not complaining about others. Like I'm not going to talk about my boss and the way he whatever. I'm not going to talk about my teacher and what he did in class. I'm not going to talk about the priest or the servant in my church and this new policy they decided to do.
Or your parents is a big one, I think.
Your parents, your politicians. You know, one of the things that I think is we're in sort of an election season and things like that. You know, the church teaches us to pray for the leaders, and the church teaches us actually to respect the leaders. That doesn't mean we always have to agree with everything that everybody says. You know, thank God we live in a country that we're allowed to sort of express our opinion, but our opinion should be like expressed in a respectful way. These people are our leaders and they deserve our respect. So whether I agree with them politically or not, you know, the church doesn't say, you know, when the leader is a Republican, you know, pray for them, and when they're a Democrat, don't, or vice versa, right? We pray for our leaders always, because the Christian value is that they are appointed as leaders, and God has at least willed for them or allowed for them to be leaders. And so we pray for them so that they lead in the best possible way for their country and for our livelihood as Christians.
That's a very interesting one, I think.
Avoiding complaints about people. I think, you know, actually avoiding complaints about people is hard in two ways. It's hard about like the people that we know that we're close to. And it's also hard about like the people that we are far from. Like imagine, like I'm a sports fan. Like how would you like, You know, like the Bears are about to, the season's about to start.
Right.
You know, it's like for me to complain about like, you know, the quarterback and what he's doing and whatever, right? That's pretty normal for me to do. So to create an exercise for myself, I'm not going to complain about people, right? And actually, it humanizes that person. Like, I don't think we have that problem with the people who are close to us. We know that they're human. The people who are like far from us, celebrities or politicians or sports figures or whatever, we dehumanize them, you know, and we complain about them because it's like we don't care about maybe their feelings or who they are, but they're people too, and they matter too, and you know they're built or created in the image of God as well, and they deserve to be, you know, respected just like anybody else. So avoiding complaints about people is a nice one. Not to condemn a group or an individual, not to do any condemnation. That's a difficult one.
What do you mean? What do you mean by
condemn? Like if, like, let's say for example, somebody's doing something wrong, and so either in my heart, like in my mind, or out loud. If this is an activity about speech, then probably out loud. I'm not going to sort of, I guess, essentially judge them. Like, oh, can you believe what they did? This was so wrong. How dare they? Whatever, you know. Okay. I'm silent when it comes to condemning them.
I feel like a lot of them are very much related.
One of the things he mentions in the book is like when I choose an exercise, what you'll find is they're interrelated in the sense that like they are still all going to, you know, you asked me like, where should I start? And one of the things he mentions in the book is like when you start at one, you will find them intertwined and interconnected, and you are gaining virtues, you know, more than one particular virtue by doing something. So when you're doing all these things, you're gaining a virtue maybe of silence or of like controlling my speech. But I don't think you can help but maybe also gain a little bit of the virtue of love, right? Because I'm starting to think more positively about these people. I'm starting to not allow myself to think negatively about those people. That causes me sort of to love them, right? So yes, they are incredibly interconnected.
That's almost identical to the gym scenario too. Like even if you only picked one muscle group.
Sure, you got compound exercises, right? You do bench press, like, yeah, sure, it's for your chest, but you know, your triceps are activated.
Everything else will grow as a result of you just focusing on one thing. So it's a lot of connections here. He
mentions another one that says, avoiding discussion of topics that you know will lead to the condemnation of others. So for example, he breaks it down. He's like, for example, talking about people who you know you don't like. So you know it's going to go south because actually I know I don't like this person, right? So I'm going to begin to speak about them. And when I begin to speak about them, I'm not going to speak about them in the nicest way because I already have, you know, I don't get along with them. They don't get along with me, whatever the case may be. Not defending myself in a way which would cast blame on others. So like... somebody like accuses you of something, or somebody sort of insinuates that you did something wrong.
Oh, you just throw someone else under the bus for doing worse.
Explaining yourself fully would throw somebody under the bus, and you decide not to, right? You know, actually, this is a wonderful example where I think there have to be some exceptions, right? If I stay silent, there might be something that would be a stumbling block to others, you know. But by and large, sure, somebody could think that I did some little inconvenient thing for the sake of them not knowing sort of this other person's sin or shame. Covering the sins of others is a virtue. You know, that's something that is, you know, that's what God does with us, you know? And so we ought to try to do the same thing. He gives a bunch of exercises about speech, more of them. He talks about, actually, this is a wonderful one, not interrupting discussions. Ooh. So like, I mean, we're on a podcast. Sometimes I talk, sometimes you talk. To have an exercise where it's like, I am not going to speak until the other person stops speaking. It sounds so simple, but actually, I know myself. I fail in this a lot. To sort of like wait until it's my turn to speak.
This is actually one of my biggest pet peeves. Just
of being interrupted, or
no, of noticing people interrupting others. Like, people interrupt me all the time, and I don't really think twice. Like, I just let it happen. But like, it's when I'm in a conversation and I'm observing other people talking, and one person just constantly is cutting off another person. I get angry a little bit. I'm like, just let them talk.
What makes you angry about it? You feel like they're being silenced?
No, it's not even that. It's that in the scenario that I'm exactly thinking of, it's like the person who's doing the cutting off is actually less qualified to talk about whatever they were talking about. And it was like,
you want to hear from the other person. Like they have ideas.
Like this is the expert, and you're just like, I don't know.
You're talking just to talk.
Yeah, it was, and it's like they're not even aware that the other person is talking once they start talking. Like
The thing is, when you think about this, like the sins are so much interconnected. Like in that scenario, what is one of the sins that is underlying here? Pride. That I have information that nobody else has. You know, like I mentioned, like the exercise of like not giving my opinion until it's asked. And I mentioned, like, when I do this, I realize, oh, they come to the conclusion or a better conclusion than I would have without me. Like they didn't need me to get there. And so it's very humbling. It's like, oh, actually people are smart too. And they can figure out they're smarter than I am. You know what I mean? I'm not always, you know, I don't have always the best ideas. There are people who have better ideas than I do. And sort of, I don't recognize it until I'm quiet to hear other people and allow them to speak. One of the things that I've heard before that I thought was really nice is like, winning an argument is not necessarily the goal. Just because you win doesn't mean you were right. It just means you won. What I mean by that is like, you think about like in a courtroom, when two lawyers are sort of against each other, there's a winner and a loser. The winner isn't always what the truth is. It's just that he won the argument. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's like there are two different things, and it's like, which one am I going for? Am I going for winning the argument, or am I going for the truth?
That's it. That's an interesting one.
And another a really nice exercise that I love, and I wish all of us could maybe practice for a little bit. It says here, circumventing or like staying away from unfamiliar topics of discussion. In a sense, like in plain English, is like, don't talk about things you don't know about. You know, we spend lots of time, you know, pretending we're experts about something because we watched a YouTube clip or saw a thing on TikTok or whatever, and all of a sudden, like, we're experts about it. And actually, we don't know the first thing about the thing we're talking about, you know? So avoiding unfamiliar topics. Imagine that as a spiritual exercise for yourself, doing that for a couple months.
I feel like I would just not talk at all. There's nothing I would be qualified to talk about.
Well, it says unfamiliar topic of discussion. So if it's things you know about, you know.
Even if I know about it, I don't know that I'm qualified. Like, what makes you I don't know. That's just how I would think. Like, I wouldn't talk to someone about like, hey, let me show you how to start up. Like, we could talk about starting a podcast. Like, I wouldn't even say that. Like, that's something
that I'm super familiar with.
For sure, definitely not engineering. That's like.
Then he goes into sort of spiritual exercises about prayer, and one of the ones that I really like that I want to highlight because it sort of teaches us, like in Orthodoxy, we're taught a sort of posture of prayer. We pray facing the east. We pray almost always standing up. We almost always pray raising our hands, you know, to heaven. Like when I was a kid, they teach us, you know, to make sure you're standing up straight and not to have good posture or whatever. And so like I can do exercises of physical attentiveness in prayer, because that physical attentiveness helps me to relate to, you know, mental and spiritual attentiveness, right? When I'm standing up straight, when I'm looking, when I'm raising up my eyes to heaven. And that's not to say I can do those things and not get distracted. I can. But those things help me to sort of maybe not be distracted. Some maybe more common ones would be like training to pray with my prayer book, with the Agbeya, memorizing Psalms. That can be a spiritual exercise, so that eventually maybe I don't need my Agbeya, or I can pray some of those Psalms by myself. Learning to pray, even small exercise, like if I'm not used to praying before I eat, this is a spiritual exercise okay, for the next 6 months, I'm going to pray right before I eat so that I have gratefulness, so that I can hopefully create it as a habit for me always. A spiritual exercise could be not limiting my prayers to when I need things, right? A spiritual exercise could be actively, daily praying for enemies, people who don't get along with me, people who hate me, or people who, God forbid, I hate or have some negative feelings towards. All of those can be nice exercises in prayer. So when you tell people, it's like, oh, I'm supposed to pray, or I want to pray more, and you say, well, how? And this is the how. You know what I mean? These are the things that I can do. There are a lot of exercises I can also do for fasting. You know, we have a whole podcast about fasting. We talked about fasting, but even fasting within itself, like there can be spiritual exercises that I can do. First and foremost, to participate in the fasts of the church. Which, by the way, I want to go back to something, and I said one of the sources of spiritual exercises, and I failed to mention one of the most important sources of spiritual exercises, which is to follow the regular liturgical life of the church. The church gives us, morning and evening raising of incense, the midnight prayers, the spiritual meetings that we have at church, the occasions like the venerations and the feast days of the saints, and all of those things are put there by our mother, the church, to place there so that they can help us build us in our spiritual life. One of the spiritual exercises that I can do, I didn't even talk about this. I don't know that it's mentioned in the book itself, but I can make a spiritual exercise, for example, of what time I go to church, to make sure I go to church before a certain time, or how many liturgies I attend in a week, or how many times I attend midnight praises. There are many, 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 many spiritual exercises that I can do surrounding the liturgical life of the church that I can find to be very beneficial. But anyway, back to fasting.
Mm-hmm.
I could fast. Of course, I fast maybe the communal, the fast of the church. But I might have a spiritual exercise of, I might fast in a certain time where there is no fasting, maybe for a particular need, maybe for the spiritual exercise itself. I may, even within fasting, while I'm fasting, I may reduce, the amount of food I eat or the amount of times I eat. Maybe I don't snack, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not eating between meals. Or maybe I can do something like I don't eat things that I would consider unnecessary. Like I wouldn't eat chocolates or sweets, or even if I'm fasting, maybe even if they're fasting, I maybe wouldn't eat them, to sort of create a spiritual exercise of asceticism within fasting, but while I'm still fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that I really love about fasting, and I've mentioned before, when I fast, if I'm fasting correctly, I should eat more simply. And when I mean simply, I also mean more inexpensively. If I'm just eating very basic foods and rice and beans and veggies and things like that, it's more inexpensive. And I can be sort of cognizant that the money I save, eating those more simpler foods, I could give. I can give alms. I can give them to the church. I can give to those in need out of the abundance that I have due to fasting. So there are many spiritual exercises that I can do in regards to fasting. I hope, like I said, this is not a catch-all of like every single spiritual exercise you can do, but I hope it inspires people to say, hey, you know what? There is certain aspects of my life that I would love to exercise out so that I can get better at or get a closer relationship with God through the practice of these virtues.
Yeah, it's kind of, I want to ask, and we went through a lot of them just now, but I want to ask how, thinking about it from a very worldly view, how can I do these things correctly? Even like the way I'm thinking of it is, for example, we talked about not gossiping and like these certain ones where it was like stay away from talking about others and things like that. And somehow I like jumped to like, what if I was like, what would we talk, like a friend group, what would we talk about? And it's like, actually there's nothing. Or like my group of guy friends, right? Like we only talk by roasting each other. Like, and that can hurt people's feelings sometimes, but it's like, if I was gonna stop hurting people's feelings and my friend group only communicates by insulting each other, I would seem like I was a little out of place.
But I think, yes. Yeah, I would actually kind of say to you, so what? Like I think, I don't mean to specifically speak about you, but like you could be normalizing bad behavior, right? Because it's normal for you doesn't mean it's right, right? Like I'm normalizing something that is maybe not right, but it's normal to me. And so when I do something out of the norm, yeah, of course, are you going to get looks from others? Are people going to be like, what are you doing? Yeah, they probably will. That doesn't necessarily mean what you're doing is wrong. Actually, it might be what you guys have been used to doing is not so right. Like you actually mentioned something very briefly. You're like, well, I don't know what I would talk about if I'm not talking about other people. Well, that doesn't mean that, I should just talk about other people. That should mean like I should really take a look at like, why is it that our discussions sort of just revolve around what other people are doing? Why can't my discussions be edifying? Why can't my discussions be building up of each other? Why can't they be positive discussions about things that we've done or things that we want to do or our hopes or our dreams? There are many, many things to talk about besides, what did that person do, or can you believe what she was wearing, or whatever the things that we like to gossip about.
So I guess one of the ways I'm thinking is probably to consider something a spiritual exercise, and I think this is a general rule for a lot of things in this category, is to avoid this pride or this feeling of like I did it all myself, is you probably shouldn't be talking about the things that, like, for example, like you don't go around when you're fasting extra, like, oh, I'm fasting today.
Of
like,
course not.
So, and I assume like a lot of the other things are like that too.
But some of the more outward spiritual exercises are people might notice.
Right.
You know, I don't go out of my way to make sure people notice. Like that is definitely prideful. But you know, if they know you to be a person who likes to make those, you know, harsh jokes, and people might notice, hey, David's not doing that, and they may ask you. I don't think there's anything wrong with answering. It's like, yeah, I'm working on trying to not do that. Because actually, if anything, if I'm being really honest, why am I working on that? Because it's a weakness, right? That's not actually prideful. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like I'm working on it because I'm not good at it. It's something that I don't like about myself, that I want to be different. It's not a point of pride. Actually, it's sure to be a point of humility.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of it as like like if my friend group all of a sudden stopped insulting each other, and I was like, guys, what happened? They're like, oh, we're really just trying to focus on you know, our spirituality. In my head, I would be like, they think they're better than me or something, like, you know, like that's the way that, you know, like, I don't know, that's just
I wish we would, you know, as just even as a community be like less inclined to doing that. Like sometimes when we see people trying to do positive things in their spiritual life, we automatically take that as judgment of ourselves. And actually, this is actually projection. Like I'm they're not being judgmental. I'm judging myself because I'm like I'm feeling my deficiencies in that moment. And sometimes I think to myself, oh, they're being self-righteous or they're judging me, when in fact nobody's judging anybody. No one's doing anything to you. Your own conscience and the Holy Spirit within you is convicting you, and you're feeling it as, or you would like to interpret it as, their fault, when it's really on you. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
I guess that would probably be pretty apparent to someone who doesn't do this self-examination thing, like as a first step, but then they notice, like, why do I feel this way when I hear XYZ?
Exactly. That's why the self-examination is so important. It's like, it's not only do I do whatever, it's also the why behind it. Like what's happening here? What is my motivation in you know, doing this sin?
So I think something that I would really struggle with is, I think and this is really diving into my brain. One of the reasons that I think I would avoid, or I do avoid, the self-examination thing is because once I identify it or kind of pinpoint it, like now I have an obligation
to do something. Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, it almost like it's like if I then identify it and still don't fix it, it's like now I've just worsened my own case.
But I can make the argument that if I know that I ought to be identifying, the lack of identifying itself is something I will be held accountable for. Right? You're saying, well, if I don't identify these things, I won't be held accountable for it. And what I'm saying is, you know that you ought to be identifying these things.
Oh, so you lose either way.
So not identifying those things, or not working to identify those things in and of itself, is a shortcoming that I should be working on.
Dang. Okay.
You know, actually, there's a saying like, ignorance is not a defense of the law. Mm-hmm. Like when you go to, like, a cop stops you and you're going 80 miles an hour and you're like, oh, I thought it was 7. I thought the speed limit was 70. And they're like, well, it's 55. It's like, well, I didn't know. If they're not in a good mood, they don't care that you didn't know, right? It's like, I had to follow the rule, whether you knew about the rule or you didn't know about the rule. And so I don't think I'll be able to plead ignorance, especially for us who, you know, maybe we're grown up in a Christian home and we've learned Christian values and we've grown up in the church. It's very hard for me to sort of claim ignorance about, you know, the need to work towards virtues or stay away from sin.
I'm almost, again, here I go taking it to an extreme because it's what I do. When you in the cop scenario, when you claim ignorance, you're almost actually admitting, like, that by admitting your ignorance, you've now, like, almost convicted yourself, like, well, I didn't know, therefore, like, it's very obvious that I was speeding, versus knowing you were doing something wrong, but then not admitting it to the cop, because they always ask you, like, how fast you're going. You never answer. You're like, oh, I was doing the speed limit, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you know, you weren't. That's almost how, like, I'm like, oh, well, I think I'm like, I don't need to work on this thing, because if I sit down, I'm like, no, I really need to work on this thing, and I don't. It's like, I don't know.
But the thing is,
I'm not fooling anyone, but
exactly.
myself,
Like I was just going to get to that same point. Is like I can trick everybody. I can even trick myself. I'm not going to be able to trick God, who sees my heart and knows my intentions. You know, there's no way to fool him.
So what are some of your favorite, I guess, if you could highlight just, 2 or 3 of your favorite spiritual exercises that
I think we mentioned a lot of my favorite ones. You know, I love the concept, like I said, of not giving my opinion unless it's asked. It's a wonderful exercise. I love the thing of like, I'm not going to say something negative about somebody, you know, whether they're there or not there. I'm not going to say something negative about somebody. A lot of these, like I said, because they're interconnected, you know, they have so many benefits for our lives. I like the exercise as far as fasting goes. Like for those of us who maybe are used to fasting, limiting sort of when I eat or how many times I eat is a great way for me to experience hunger within fast, which is, I think, an important thing. Because part of fasting is to sacrifice the body. So you can't go wrong with any spiritual exercise, but those are maybe a couple of mine that I really like, to do. I like the ones most especially that are dealing with sins of the tongue and that have to do with my relationship with people. There was one, actually, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but not to be argumentative. Like somebody says something and I disagree with them. Is it important for me to make sure that they know that I disagree? I'm always, the thing is, it's so interesting to see different personality types. There are people who can sit in a discussion, they got 8, 10, 12 people sitting in the discussion. And it's like, I disagree, right? And for me, when I disagree, you're going to know that I disagree. Mm-hmm. But there are many people who they sit in a discussion and they disagree. And then you talk to them after, like, yeah, I didn't agree with anything he said. It's like, oh, why didn't you say anything? It's like, oh, well, I didn't really feel like I needed to. It's so, I mean, so it's possible, right? You look at it, it's like, it's possible. I can do it that way. Mm-hmm. And so those are wonderful exercises to sort of gain virtues of silence, being more cautious about sinning of the tongue, that sort of thing.
And so I guess I maybe have 1 or 2 more questions, but this watching your tongue is really, really heavily emphasized and not talking as much. And
well, I think a lot of our sins are sins of the tongue.
That's what I was.
They're either the sins of the tongue or sins of thought.
So by controlling your
controlling my tongue, that's the first step to controlling my thoughts, right? If I've perfectly achieved control of tongue, then maybe I would move towards the control of my intent of my thoughts and my heart. But I can't do that until I control what I'm saying. Because you could have hatred within your heart that you don't express, right? But if I'm expressing it, the first step would be to stop expressing it before I'm going to be able to remove it from my heart.
That kind of perfectly ties into the next question. The book kind of briefly touched on like mastering a exercise or virtue. Is our goal to master whatever virtue we start, or is it how would you know that you've mastered something, I guess?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to be clear. My goal is not any of the exercises themselves, right? My goal is to be like Christ. But I would say if I set for myself a spiritual exercise, and it's a specific thing, right? We said we try to be specific. And so when I master it would be that I'm doing this thing regularly and it's become a part of my life. And then I can raise the level of what it is, right? We talked about so many spiritual exercises of the tongue. And the book mentions sort of the height of those spiritual exercises is the virtue of silence, right? Like I don't speak, or I very rarely speak. Mm-hmm. That virtue came after many, many, many other virtues. Like I didn't gossip, I didn't condemn others, I didn't speak poorly about them, until I got to the virtue of, maybe one level was like, I won't speak whether good or bad, or only my speech is going to be only edifying. You know what I mean? There are many levels. So, I mean, I don't think it's really super important for us to say, look, have I mastered something or not? I should always be progressing, or I should always be attempting to progress. And that's, again, where my spiritual father comes in, and maybe he might say to me, okay, we're at somewhere good at this exercise. Maybe we can find a different exercise to begin.
So last question on kind of the topic as a whole. Does chasing a relationship with God or working on these exercises or just growing spiritually, does it ever become, I don't know if easier is the right word, but the way I'm thinking of it is people that religiously go to the gym, right? They go regardless how they feel.
Sure.
And it's not even an option to be like, I don't know if I want to go today.
Yeah.
It's I'm going,
Sure,
whether I feel like it or not, rain or shine.
yeah.
Does our spirituality ever get to that point where it's I'm really struggling, but it doesn't matter how I feel, it doesn't matter what I'm going through, I'm always got my sights set on God, and that's what I'm pushing towards? Does it ever get easier?
A couple of things. First, you said like chasing my spiritual journey or chasing God, and like I want to be clear. You probably just use that as a term, but like I'm not chasing God as if He's running away from me. You know what I mean? God wants me to have a relationship with Him too. So it's not something that is like I'm getting a relationship in spite of what God, God wants me to be in a relationship with Him. But I love the analogy of exercise, because ask anybody who lifts regularly or runs regularly. They're not every day that they want to do it. There are aspects of it they like, and there are aspects of it they don't like. Waking up an hour before I need to maybe doesn't always feel so great. Tearing up my muscles, so that they can rebuild bigger doesn't feel so good. Exhausting my lungs beyond what they're capable of doing in order to, get a higher, lung capacity. That's painful in some ways. So I think to keep the analogy of exercising, if I want to maintain exactly where I am, I could probably do that in a pretty easy way. If I want to grow, it's going to take some effort from me, and it's going to be a little uncomfortable. Growth in general, whether it be spiritual growth, whether it be growth in my career, whether it be growth in my social life, whether it be growth in like physical fitness, all of those things, no pain, no gain in everything. It's not just about my spiritual life. It's not just about, my health life. I think that rings true for every single aspect of our lives.
Okay. Anything else you want to?
I hope, no, the last thing I would say is I just hope that if this was successful, or how I would measure it being successful, because we still have to have specific, is that people would listen and choose for themselves, a spiritual goal, maybe speak to their spiritual father about an exercise that they can do, and start and begin and, take notes about how it's going and to improve, so that they can begin to see and taste, like what you're mentioning, like the sweetness, to speak more to what you're talking about, like, does it ever get easier? When people first, learn an instrument or go to work out or whatever, they don't enjoy it because it's confusing and hard and they're not good at it. As they get better, there is an aspect that is fun and exciting for them because they like it, they get good at it. And so, to begin to taste the sweetness of my relationship with God and His closeness and things like that will encourage me to gain virtue and virtue upon virtue, by God's grace. So I hope that this encourages people to begin seeking out spiritual exercises with the guidance of their spiritual father.
Perfect. That's sounds good to me.
All right.
Thank you, Bruno.